Your mic is muted, sir. We cannot hear you, sir. Your mic is muted.
Yeah, is Brother Golding there?
No, sir.
All right. Well, thank you for turning on the Year 2 GSP online platform. Okay. Is Brother Golding sick?
I'm not sure, sir.
All right.
Give me 5 minutes. I'm going to call.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Yes.
I will go ahead with the class, and you can tell him that the class has started.
All right.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to begin our class by going to God in prayer. Father in heaven, I pray a blessing upon our class. It is a well-needed class for all Christians, not only Christian leaders, but all members of Christ Church. We pray that you will help us to learn the lessons and to use them as we interact with non-Christians and try to convert them, that they might have faith in you and faith in Jesus and follow his teachings. May you be with me as I present this lesson, and I pray that you may give me the wisdom to present it in an understandable way. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, I'll mark the register first, and then I'll begin. Okay, I see Brother McIntosh is present. Just waiting for Brother Golding, but I will continue at this time. We're looking at the Beginner's Apologetics, Year 2, Trimester 1, 2022 course outline. I'm just going to enlarge it so you can see it better. Well, today, Friday, January 21, we begin unit number 2, entitled Arguments to Show that Evolution is False. And we will begin lesson 11, The Worldwide Flood, the Key to Understand the Fossil Record. Now, what we did in the previous units was to look at why every Christian should study apologetics. We also looked at the Bible being the inspired word of God and evidences to show inside of the Bible and outside of the Bible that it is inspired by God. Then we looked at scientific laws that evolution contradicts. And now we are continuing to look at arguments to show that evolution is false. And I begin with the worldwide flood, which is the key to understand the fossil record. Or let me just get something clear. Israel, are you in year 2 apologetics? Israel?
Yes, sir.
You're in year 2 apologetics.
Yes, sir.
All right, okay. I will write you down in my register.
Yes.
Brother Golding, are you there now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Friday, January 28, test number 1. I have planned to give the first test, but that all depends on if I complete the lesson today. Test number 1 would be over the lesson today, the flood, the key to understand the fossil record. Friday, February 4, we will have a discussion of any questions or comments you have on the results of test number 1. Then we will move on to lesson 12, do similar body parts and similar DNA mean that we all have the same common ancestor or the same common designer? Then on Friday, February 11, you will have test number 2 on that lesson. Following that, Friday, February 18, we will discuss the results of the test and move on to lesson 13, do similarities between human and animal embryos mean that we all have the same ancestor? Friday, February 25, we will have test number 3, do similarities between human and animal embryos mean that we all have the same ancestor? Friday, March 5, I will discuss the test results with you. Then we will move on to lesson 14, does junk DNA prove evolution? Friday, March 11, we will have test number 4, does junk DNA prove evolution? Friday, March 18, we will discuss test 4, then move on to lesson 15, do useless organs prove that evolution has taken place? On Friday, March 25, we will have test 5 on that lesson. On Friday, April 1, we will have a discussion of test 5, and then we will have a review of lessons 11 to 15 in preparation for the final exam. And on Friday, April 8, we will have the final exam based on lessons 11 to 15. So this is an outline of where we are going in this course for trimester 1. I'm now going to be moving on to the PowerPoint presentation. Well, that's not the right one, so let me come out of it.
Did you send the apologetics file to us at any point, Brother Buckland? Let me see if I mean look.
Okay, I'll soon answer your question. Let me just look at and see if this is the right one. No, that's not. All right. I'm coming to you. Let me just go and see if I can get it. Here too. How do I have that? Okay, good. Okay, I'm going to share that lesson now. Okay, Brother McIntosh, what were you asking?
Oh no, I was looking through. I did not see a file on the Google Drive for apologetics. I was wondering if we had gotten it, or I'm just not the one who did it.
Okay, the PowerPoints that were sent yesterday were sent to your email. The PowerPoints are comfortably sent through the email system to your email.
Okay.
I didn't need Google Drive. I sent it directly to your email.
No, I mean this one that we're doing now, or this one is going to be sent to my email also.
Yes, every lesson is going to be sent to your email.
All right. Okay. Okay.
Or that is only after I teach the lesson. So I don't send it in advance, but I send it after I teach the lesson. Okay, so we're looking at lesson 11. The worldwide flood is the key to understand what the fossil record shows us and why the evolutionary origin of life and its development is false.
Yeah.
The general objectives for lesson 11 are: 1, to examine evidences that the living things which are now fossils were all living at the same time. 2, to examine evidences that the living things which are now fossils were buried and fossilized first. 3, to examine evidences that long periods of time are not necessary to explain the fossil record. The specific objectives are: 1, at the end of this lesson, the students will have analyzed 2 evidences that the living things which are now fossils were all living at the same period of time, not different periods of time. 2, at the end of this lesson, the students will have discussed 4 evidences that the living things which are now fossils were buried and fossilized first. 3, at the end of this lesson, the students will have demonstrated from 4 evidences that living things which are now fossils did not need a long time to become fossils. 4, at the end of this lesson, the students will have proven that the fossils were formed after sin and death had entered the world and in the worldwide flood of Noah's time. Now, the evidences that the living things which are now fossils were all living at the same time. But before I go into this, I'm going to be defining some words that may not be clear. What do I mean by fossils? A fossil is a dead thing, whether it is a human or an animal or a plant, that has become hardened into a rock. And so its form or shape has been preserved. Whether it is the body has been preserved, or whether it is the skeletal remains have been preserved, fossils are preserved remains of things that used to be alive in the past, but are now dead. And they are found in rocks that have been laid down by water. And you have different layers of rocks having dead things that have been preserved in the rocks. Now, let me tell you a little bit about evolution so you can understand what I am arguing against. People who believe in evolution generally do not believe that there is a creator who created everything in the beginning. They believe that life came from non-living chemicals in water that covered the earth in the beginning, and that by chance, these living things developed into complicated living things, and that we all, whether we are human beings, animals, or plants, we all, they say, came from one original living cell that formed by accident in the waters that covered the earth. And
That's
so,
the amoeba.
say that for me again.
Oh, that's what they call the amoeba.
Oh, amoeba. Okay.
Amoeba, sorry.
Yes. Okay, well, no, the amoeba is clearly visible. What I'm dealing with is one cell that is microscopic. Your own eye cannot see it. And it developed into different kinds of living things. But an amoeba would be a good example of what I am saying, that it was found in the water and it developed and became more complex after millions of years passed. And they believe that the simplest living things are found in the lowest layer of rock. And as you go up to the top layer of rock, the living things become more sophisticated or complicated till we come to the most complicated living things of all, and that is human beings. So that is their interpretation of these dead things that have been preserved in the rocks. They believe that it teaches that everything originated from one living cell, which in turn originated by chance from non-living chemicals that were floating in the water long time ago. So we are looking in this lesson at evidences that the living things which are now fossils were all living at the same time. And what I mean by living at the same time, the evolutionists believe that these fossils were not all living at the same time. They believe that there was a development that shows change over time into more complicated, complex living things, and that they were living at different times, separated by millions and millions of years. And so if you were to prove that they were all living at the same time, it would show that the evolutionary theory is not valid, is not true. Now, number one, a rock layer named for a specific period of time contains fossils from different time periods. Let me read that again. A rock layer or a layer of rock named for a specific period of time. Let us say they say it was from 1 billion years ago, contains fossils, that is the remains of creatures that used to be alive, but they're now preserved in the rock, contains fossils from different time periods, whether it is 1 billion years ago, 2 billion years ago, 3 billion years ago, 4 billion years ago. They are all found from different time periods. That is, if you believe in evolution. And that creates a problem for evolution, because if certain creatures don't belong to 1 billion years ago, but belong to 4 billion years ago, then why are you seeing that creature in the rock layer that is estimated to be 1 billion years old? Something is wrong. Now, here is a quotation. Fossils are being found, quote, in the wrong place all the time. Now, it doesn't mean that they are in the wrong place, but if you are a believer in evolution, you would say it is in the wrong place because they're not supposed to be in that time period that they are found in. This was an observation or a comment made by Michael Ord, who has his Master of Science in Atmospheric Science and is a researcher in earth science. And he wrote an article entitled, "Are Fossils Ever Found in the Wrong Place?" And you may read more about that on this website, creation.com/fossils wrong place. Number two, there are vast fossil graveyards found throughout the world, consisting of animals and plants, which evolutionists have placed in different periods of time, represented by the different rock layers. But here is the problem for evolutionists. these animals and plants from so-called different periods of time are found mixed up together. Now, how could this be true? How could it be true that they were from different periods of time and they are found in the same graveyard? One creature that was thought to have evolved into a different creature is found in the same graveyard. How could it be if they were living in different periods of time and should be found in a different rock layer from the ancestor? So this is a problem. Now, let me give you some specific information about these graveyards. In Agate Springs, in the state of Nebraska, the United States of America, there is a fossil graveyard of about 9,000 animals and plants, consisting of rhinoceroses, horses, camels, giant wild boars, birds, plants, trees, seashells, and fish. Now, here is something strange. The evolutionists say that that living cell that developed in the water that covered the earth eventually developed into a fish. And so they claim that the fish is the ancestor of every living thing. So how can you find fish in the same place with rhinos, horses, camels, giant wild boars, birds, plants, and trees? How can you find them all together when the fish is thought to have been the ancestor of every living thing by evolutionists? They shouldn't be in the same place, but yet they are found in this fossil graveyard. Another information comes from Alaska, which is the westernmost section of the United States in the northeastern section, and Siberia, which is in the northeastern section of Russia. In the Alaska and Siberia area, there were found a graveyard of bears, wolf, fox, badgers, saber-toothed cat, jaguar, lynx, mammoth, mastodon, horses, camel, antelope, bison, caribou, moose, elk, sheep, musk ox, yak, ground sloth, and several rodents. Now, if evolution were true, you shouldn't find all of these different life forms in the same place, yet they're all mixed up together in the Alaska and Siberia area where fossil graveyards were found. In France, hundreds of thousands of marine creatures, that is sea creatures, are buried with amphibians. Amphibians are creatures that live in the water and on the land. Spiders, scorpions, millipedes, insects, and reptiles in a fossil graveyard. How could all of them be together if evolution is true, and that these creatures were only a gradual development from an original fish? Yet they're all together. In Wyoming, in the United States of America, alligators, fish, birds, turtles, mammals, many varieties of insects, and palm leaves are buried in the Green River. Again, why do we have all of these creatures together in the same place if evolution were true and that we all evolved from the fish? How are they all together? So that is my question. If these animals belonged to different periods of time, and I'm talking about long periods of time, like millions and billions of years apart, and one had evolved into another, how is it that they were found buried together? let us look at evidences that these living things, which are now fossils, were buried and fossilized first. Now, why am I looking at the speed at which these creatures were buried and turned into rock? In order for the evolutionary theory to fit the evidences that are in the rocks, there has to be a slow, gradual burial of these dead things. It cannot be quick. It has to be slow, because evolution, in theory, takes a long time. It takes a long time for one creature to change into a more complex creature. It does not happen fast. And if these creatures were living at different times, the burial process should be gradual and slow, not fast. And also the speed at which these dead creatures turn into rock, in which their skin and their flesh and their muscles and their skeleton are replaced with mineral deposits brought by the mineral-rich water that drowned them. That the process of getting them turned into minerals, into rocks, should also be slow. Yet what do we find? Number one, all around the world, in rock layer after rock layer, there are billions of dead things that have been buried in water, carried mud and sand. In other words, the mud and the sand was carried by the water and laid down and later hardened into rock. Their state of preservation, that is how well they have been kept, how little they have deteriorated over the years, frequently shows that there had to be rapid burial and fossilization, just like one would expect in the flood of Noah's time. If there was a slow burial, what would happen to the fish? What would happen to the spiders? What would happen to the alligators? What would happen to the birds? Wouldn't there be some creature that would eat them? Creatures that eat dead and decaying things, wouldn't they have eaten them? And if they were eaten before they were completely buried, how would their remains be preserved until now, if the burial process was very slow and gradual? And it would have to be slow and gradual if evolution were to be true. And if they turn into rocks, if they turn into minerals very slowly, how would that work when you have in the water different bacteria that would feed on the dead and decaying thing and make it deteriorate and decay rapidly? It would not be preserved. So the mechanism for preserving these fossils in such a great state of preservation must have been a rapid burial and fossilization, not slow and gradual as evolution would expect to have happened. Number two, there is abundant evidence that many of the rock layers were laid down quickly, one after the other, without significant time breaks between them. How do we know this? Well, we have preservation of animal tracks in the rocks. How could you have animal tracks preserved in the rocks if the rocks just slowly formed? Let me give an example. When people are making sidewalks and they're pouring the cement, sometimes you have dogs walking over the cement, or you have some school children walking on the cement. And when the cement hardens, you see the dog tracks and you see the footprints or the shoe prints of the school children. Well, in order for the animal tracks to be preserved in the rocks, it would require a rapid fossilization. If it were slow and gradual, it would not have been preserved. It would have been washed away and removed. The trace of the animal tracks would have been removed. Even ripple marks. You know, when you throw a little stone into a river, you see circles moving away from the center where the rock hit the water. That is what you call ripple marks. There are ripple marks in the rocks, showing that at one time it was in a state where ripples could be made when it was being laid down by the water. But how would the ripple marks remain if it were a slow process of these things turning into rocks? Even raindrop marks are preserved in the rocks. How could this happen if the rocks were formed gradually and slowly over millions of years? It shows that there must have been a rapid formation of the rocks in their different layers. Also, we see that many of the same fossil remains are not in one layer of rock alone, but their preserved remains are in many different layers of rock, which again shows that the different layers of rock are not different periods of time, but the same period of time in which these living things, trees and animals, lived. Another indication that shows that the laying down of the rocks and their formation was quick is that there is a scarcity of erosion. In order for erosion to take place, it has to be around, the soil has to be around for a long period of time, exposed to wind and water. But there is hardly any erosion seen between one rock layer and another, which shows again a rapid laying down of the different layers of rock. These are different layers of rock. These are people at the bottom. So you see how huge the layers of rock are. There is hardly any erosion between one rock layer and another. There is also hardly any soil formation. It takes quite a while for soil to form from dead and decaying creatures. Yet there is hardly any soil formation between one layer of rock and another. There is also hardly any animal burrows. There are some animals that dig holes in the soil in order to have their home built. Like foxes have holes, Jesus said. So there are hardly any animal burrows in these rocks. And roots between layers of rock are hardly seen. In order for roots to be able to take their place there, they would have to be around for a while. The plant or the tree would have to be there for a while. So the scarcity of erosion, soil formation, animal burrows, and roots between layers of rock also show they must have been deposited or laid down in quick succession. Number 4, we're looking at evidences that the fossils were buried and fossilized fast. The radical or great or extreme deformation of thick layers of sediment without evidence of cracking or melting also shows how all the layers must have been still soft when they were bent. Notice that there are no cracks in the bending of these layers of rock. There is no sign of any rocks melting. And so it must mean that when these layers were soft, they were laid down rapidly by water and quickly turned into rocks. We're now looking at reasons long periods of time are not necessary to explain the fossil record. There are many examples of rock forming rapidly. For examples, you have a clock, a spark plug, and keys, which have all been found in sedimentary rock. And we know that clocks, spark plugs, and keys were not fossils from millions of years ago, but are recent inventions. So even today, we have items that are recently invented that have become rock. They have become encased in rock. And this shows that it does not take long periods of time for this to happen. John Whitmore, who has his Doctor of Philosophy in geology, had this to say: long periods of time are not required to harden rock. Sedimentary rock generally consists of sediment, mud, sand, or gravel that has been turned into rock. Evolutionary paleontologists. A paleontologist is someone who studies ancient civilizations. So this evolutionary paleontologist, Dr. Philip Curry, admitted that fossilization can take a few hours. Now, this is quite significant for someone who believes in evolution. He's admitting that long periods of time are not necessary to explain the fossil record. Yet his own evolutionary theory says that these fossils were buried and they were turned into rock slowly and gradually over millions and even billions of years. Yet he says it can take a few hours. He also says if the groundwater is heavily laden with minerals in solution, the process can happen rapidly. Let us now look at recent observations and experiments that show that long periods of time are not necessary to explain the fossil record. Fossil fuels do not need millions of years to form. That is the standard evolutionary belief, that fossil fuels that have been discovered underneath the ground, developed after millions of years of the decomposition of these dead plants and animals. But it has now been discovered that fossil fuels do not need millions of years to form. In December of 2013, it was published, scientists at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory are claiming success in perfecting a method that can transform a pea-soupy solution of algae into crude oil by pressure cooking it for about, notice the time, 30 minutes. 30 minutes. The process called hydrothermal liquefaction also works in other streams of organic matter, such as municipal sewage. The crude oil created is lightweight and low in sulfur and can be dropped into refineries that process fossil crudes. Number 4, the technology described as one that mimics nature. Notice mimic is to imitate. And if you're imitating nature, you're doing what is found in the environment. So the technology described as one that mimics nature produces oil in much the same way that nature produces oil, but it is completed in around 30 minutes instead of millions of years. That comes from Australia. So this shows that it is not necessary that there be millions of years to explain the origin of fossil fuels under the earth. We're still looking at observations and experiments that show that long periods of time are not necessary to explain the fossil record. As is now well known by most geologists, wood can petrify rapidly. That is, wood can turn into rock speedily. Several laboratory experiments have devised ways in which this can be done. And notice what is said, mirroring or reflecting natural settings. Well, if it mimics nature, as was shown in a previous experiment, and if it is mirroring what goes on in nature, then why can't this be applied to nature itself and to say that it was not long for the wood to turn into rock? It was not long for the sediments laid down by water to turn into rock. It was not long for the dead things preserved in the rocks to turn into fossil fuels. Number 6, in the fossil record, there are copulating frog hoppers. That is, frog hoppers in the position of having sexual relations, which had to have been fossilized quickly for them to be found in the same position and be well preserved. So this is strong evidence that the process of fossils being encased in rock and mineralized and turning into rock themselves was something that was rapid and not gradual and slow. Number 7, 5 octopus fossils have been found in Lebanon. All 8 arms, muscles, suckers, and ink. Now, these are soft-bodied creatures. They don't have skeletons, whether on the outside or on the inside. They are soft-bodied creatures, and yet they have been preserved. If these were not buried and fossilized quickly, they could not have been preserved. It is known that the ocean floor is teeming with bacterial life. That is, there is a lot of bacteria on the floor of the ocean, which could have eaten the octopuses had they not been quickly buried and fossilized. So let us put all of this information together. What is the conclusion? The conclusion is the time of Noah explains the fossil record, not evolution. And here are my reasons. The fossils show that there was cancer of the bone, teeth marks, and signs of drowning. Okay, so it must have been a time before there was any disease. It must have been a time before there were animals eating each other. It must have been a time before there was death. The fossils show disease. It shows savagery, brutality, and it shows death. Number 2, the fossils also show rapid burial and fossilization. It could not have been slow and gradual. Now, what are the significance of the first 2 points? The Bible teaches us about a time that when God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, that he found that all that he created was very good. Genesis chapter 1, verse 31. This was before there was any disease, before there were any animals eating each other. For God had commanded that the food for the animals should be from the green plants. So there were no animals eating each other, and there was no death. How could cancer be called very good? How could animals dying because they are being killed and eaten be very good? How could death be very good? At this time in the history of the world, there were no diseases, no animals eating each other, and no drowning, no deaths.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
All right. Based on the reasoning that you're saying just now, God saw that it was very good and that there was no animals eating each other, etc., because that wouldn't be very good. The question that we would ask is animals eating each other actually bad? Or because what is the context of very good at that time? Just for information. It says, so God saw that it was good. But suppose what he saw that was good was animals eating each other, because that is the what you would call the extent of nature. It's nature that things have to live in order for things to thrive, because the
Okay.
earth does have a capacity.
All right, thank you for the question. Well, in Genesis chapter 1, before it is written that God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Before that verse, in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 30, it says, unto every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for meat, that is for food. And it was so. So at this time in the history of the animals, God had made the green plants for them to eat. So this is the specific evidence that at this time, we shouldn't find teeth marks in the bodies, the fossilized bodies of animals. So whatever time these animals died because they were eaten, whatever time it was that they died because they had disease, it must have been a time later than the beginning, because at that time there were no animals eating each other. And at that time there was no death, there were no diseases. It was very good. So very good means that there were no diseases, and God had made the animals in such a way that they were to eat vegetation and not to eat each other. So at that time, you shouldn't expect to find diseases and teeth marks or signs of drowning in what God had created. We do find these things, so it must have been a later time when these fossils developed disease, when these creatures developed diseases, when they started to eat each other, and when they actually drowned. It must have been a later time than Genesis chapter 1. Also in number 2, it had to be rapid burial and fossilization. Otherwise, these fossils would not have been preserved to the great extent that they have been. Number 3, the fossils show that different living things, which evolutionists place in vastly different periods of time, were all found mixed up together in graveyards all over the world, indicating that all these living things were in the same period of time. Number 4, this drowning, rapid burial, and fossilization could not have happened before sin and death had entered the world. Romans chapter 5 verse 12 says, by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin. So how did death come? Death came into the world through the sin of Adam and Eve. And so the death of these creatures must have taken place sometime after Adam and Eve had sinned, including also the suffering and the pain that the creation in general suffered. In Romans chapter 8, verses 20 and 22, we read that the creation was subjected to vanity. Vanity means emptiness, nothingness. And it means that creation was not allowed to live to fulfill its purpose. Creation was only here for a short time, and then that generation of creatures would die. And so their lives were subjected to vanity. It's as if everything that they did in life would end up in nothing, in futility. And Romans 8 verse 22 says that the whole creation is groaning in the pains of childbirth until now. Well, how did this happen? It happened as a result of Adam and Eve's sin. Adam and Eve's sin not only affected human beings, but affected the creation or nature in general. And that is why it must have been at a later time after sin came into the world that you have cancer, you have teeth marks found in the fossils of animals, and you have drowning. That wasn't there in the beginning. That came about after sin and death had entered the world. Number 5, this drowning, rapid burial, and fossilization must have taken place after sin and death had entered the world in the worldwide flood in the time of Noah. As the Bible explains in Genesis chapter 7, verse 23, and every living substance was destroyed, which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle, and the creeping things, and the fowl of the heaven, and they were destroyed from the earth. And Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. So we know that these fossils do not belong to the time before Adam and Eve sinned and before death entered the world. That this came after sin and death. And so we place the fossils then in the time when Noah lived, when the world was flooded and both humans and animals that were not in the ark died and were rapidly buried and fossilized or turned into rock. And these are the fossils. They were all living at the same time. They did not evolve from an ancestor, from simple to complex forms of life. And so the geology, what we find in the rocks under the ground, do not support evolution. But what happened in the time of Noah explains the fossil record. Now, for further information, I would encourage you to look at this website. It is actually a video, and it will go into more scientific detail about fossils, evidence something happened quickly, not slowly. And I would like you to study this PowerPoint lesson in preparation for test number 1 on Friday, January 28th next week. Okay, and you can look at the recording on the YouTube channel. And if you want to see the presentation of the lesson again. Okay, it's near to lunchtime. No, it's not lunchtime yet. Okay, it's near to another class that I have. So if you have any questions, you can email me and I will get back to you on that. Well, thanks. God bless you. I'll see you at another time.
All right, sir.